So I started trying to draft my outline for the lit analysis I'm going to do on the first chapter of the things they carried, also called the things they carried. And I started laying it out the way I do a formal outline with the introduction, body paragraph one, body paragraph two. And even though it's not always three paragraphs in the body, laying it out to have three main ideas is usually a pretty good plan. However, I don't even know what I want to do yet. So I'm skipping the outline and I'm just going to look for my raw material. So I'm going to look for my evidence and see where my evidence leads me. And I in fact don't even have a lens chosen yet. I want to pick a couple of pieces of evidence I feel like can work with. And then my approach is going to be that after I pick my evidence, I'm going to then figure out what lends itself to uh, looking at these pieces of evidence. For some people, I know that they can choose a lens first and then look for evidence, and that's fine too. It just depends on how you want to approach the paper. So I have generated some quotes I feel like I can use. I don't know what I'm going to focus on quite yet. I do know that right away when I'm doing my evidence gathering, I want to cite it properly in MLA format. And because this is a literary analysis and not research, I'm going to use the Modern Language Association formatting for my in-text citations. So the first quote that I found was from the first page of the book. In the late afternoon after a day's march, he would dig his foxhole, wash his hands under a canteen, unwrap the letters, hold them with the tips of his fingers, and spend the last hour of light pretending. And that's about Jimmy Cross. But then, as I continue reading the chapter, it keeps talking about the death of Ted Lavender. And I need to figure out what I want to focus on because this chapter is all over the place. I could focus on Jimmy Cross. I could focus on the things that the men carry. I could focus on the death of Ted Lavender. Um, and I'm really going to have to narrow my focus in order to successfully choose any more evidence. And I think that more than Jimmy Cross's fixation with Martha, I feel like the death of Ted Lavender is a big deal. So I might disregard some of the things that I'm finding about Jimmy Cross and just what they carried unless I can tie it into the death of Ted Lavender. Um, O'Brien, the narrator, mentions Ted Lavender's fear and what he carried, I think, two or three times before the section where it starts talking about his actual death, the details of his actual death. In the section where it starts talking about the details of his actual death, O'Brien, the narrator, starts talking about in that section what they carried was partly a function of rank, partly of field specialty. And as he talks about that and what different people carry, he talks about what Jimmy Cross carries as the lieutenant and platoon leader. He talks about as the RTO, Mitchell Sanders carried the radio. As the medic, Rat Kiley carried a satchel filled with morphine and plasma. As a big man, and therefore the machine gunner, Henry Dobbins carries the M60. And then it talks about as PFCs or Spec 4s, most of them were common grunts and carried the standard M16 gas-operated assault rifle. And it kind of goes into what they carried as far as the grunts or the privates. But then he kind of he talks about how Ted Lavender carries more because he was scared, and then he follows this tangent into giving the first details of Ted Lavender's death. So I feel like I'm going to use this evidence. What they carried was partly a function of rank and partly of field specialty. I'm going to use this evidence to explain that as the narrator and as telling the story, O'Brien doesn't necessarily intend to talk about the death of Ted Lavender as much as he does. He just kind of goes there repeatedly as he's telling the story, because as soon as he talks about the death of Ted Lavender in the next section, he automatically just goes back to this factual retelling of, in addition to the 3 standard weapons, they carry the M60, M16, and M79. They carried whatever presented itself. So it's almost like he didn't mean to go into this place where he's talking about how Ted Lavender just fell, and how Kiowa just kept saying over and over again, he just fell, he just boomed down, fell. So I feel like I can examine that, probably using the psychological lens, and I think that's what I'm going to focus this paper on. So the evidence has kind of led me to this idea, one of the ideas that I will look at in the paper, and I will obviously look at more than just one idea, but there is this idea through the psychological lens of the unintentional, it seems almost unintentional recounting of Ted Lavender's death over and over again. And it feels almost like something that's rising out of O'Brien the narrator's subconscious. Like he can't get away from it. He cannot get away from the death of Ted Lavender, and he mentions Ted Lavender's fear over and over again, and how he approached the war because of that fear. And I need to decide if O'Brien is tying Lavender's death to Lavender's fear, or if he feels like whether he was scared or not, he would have died that death. But it does seem like his death and his fear are mentioned simultaneously, kind of in connection with each other. And I feel like that's an idea I want to explore more, thinking about the psychology of why O'Brien, the narrator, is coming back to this topic again and again. So as I continue gathering evidence and looking for what I'm doing here, one of the things that I'm realizing is there's so much information in the first chapter of the book that it's in so many quotes that stand out that I could do something with, that it's really hard to narrow down my focus. So one of the things I'm finding myself having to do is look for patterns within the text. And within the text, I see a couple of patterns. I see the words, the things they carried. I see throughout the first chapter, Tim O'Brien, the narrator, coming back to Jimmy Cross, and Tim O'Brien, the narrator, coming back to Ted Lavender. So I think that I'm going to focus mostly on Ted Lavender. And I have a couple of ideas after looking at what evidence I want to use and trying to create a massive pile of quotes. I think that one of the things I want to do is look at how each time O'Brien comes back to mentioning the death of Ted Lavender, he adds more detail than the time he described it before. So the first description was just he went to the bathroom, and Kiowa describes him as boom down. And the second description is much more graphic. It talks about how Lee Strunk had gone to search the tunnel, and when he came out, the men were relieved that nothing had happened. And so he started making ghost sounds, and right as he made the ghost sound, ooh, Ted Lavender was shot in the head. And then it has a super graphic description of that. So I think that, and then it talks, about how the platoon reacted afterwards. So one of the ideas is how he adds more detail. Another idea is how each time he talks about the death of Ted Lavender, he uses a different character's reaction. So one of the times he talks about Kiowa, another time he talks about Rat Kiley, another time he talks about Mitchell Saunders, and another time he talks about Jimmy Cross. And so that's another thing I want to talk about. And I think what I'm going to end with is why he needs to come back to it. Why does he need to tell the story over and over and over again? And looking at this through the psychological lens, I think maybe my overarching idea is just going to be that the act of writing this story, the act of writing about the things they carried, has forced Tim O'Brien, the narrator, to process um, what seems to be the first death of a friend or an acquaintance that he witnessed in Vietnam. And in telling the story and trying to set the stage, he cannot help but going back to the death of Ted Lavender and describing it repeatedly. And I did find a quote about that, about over and over. They'd say over and over, there it is, as if the repetition itself were an act of poise, a balance between crazy and almost crazy. And I don't know if I want to use that within the body of my paper or in the conclusion, but I feel like I need to use it somewhere. So I've got an idea of my main points here, and I just have to figure out a thesis at this point and kind of organize it, but the evidence led me here. So I'm going to talk about how he adds detail each time he talks about it. I'm going to talk about how he focuses on the reactions of different characters within the text. And then I'm going to talk about his need to replay this over and over and over again and what he's trying to accomplish psychologically for himself as he's telling the story.